like the Bill Sanchez character in the movie, in a seersucker suit and a pork pie hat, and one of his constituents is greeting him and saying, "Oh, Governor, so happy to meet you after all these years. I've voted for you every time you've run for anything." And he said, "Oh, thank you, thank you. It's always good to meet my constituents." He sees me, and then he gives the high sign to his aide, and he comes across the antique cars to me and literally grabs me by the lapel and kind of brings me down into this grassy culvert next to these antique cars on display. And I say something like, "Well, Governor, glad to see you after all these years. You've certainly put a lot of weight on your resume since we were," I'm always putting my foot in my mouth, and since we were colleagues together on Project Pegasus. And to his credit, he said, he's got a great sense of humor, he said, "Not just on my resume." And he said, "But listen, Andy, look, I know all about the program, you were in it, and if I was in your situation, been completely cut off from it after you were in it, knowing that serious technologies were involved." In fact, one of his colleagues had said to him when he was a 25-year-old on the project within earshot of me, his colleague said, "I can't believe they're doing this with human beings. There have to be side effects." And Bill Richardson, walking along him as the ultimate politician, said, "Well, whatever they are, they can't be good." You know? Okay. So he knew the situation I was in, which is I was tracking back to figure out what the hell had happened to me and what the significance of it was, what the consequences were. And he said, "But you have to understand something. I support your investigation," but this was before, while I was still investigating. This was June of 2003, before I had even done a public address, which happened in 2004 in Portland. I hadn't been on radio talking about my experiences. I had just tipped off the CIA that I was actively investigating. And we were put into place there. It was an arranged meeting through my historian friend from Texas. And he said, "But you have to understand something. I'm the governor of a state. And I'm a governor of a state called New Mexico, which has a city called Roswell. And I think the analogy here is to the extraterrestrial situation. If I was suddenly convene a press conference in Santa Fe with you or anybody establishing that gray extraterrestrials crashed in Roswell in 1947 and their bodies were recovered, my career in government would be toast. That would not be a credible event as a public servant. I would not survive the giggle factor of such a press conference." So he says, "Well, I don't think it's as extreme in terms of from the point of view of the public. You have to understand that while I may try to help you from time to time, you cannot publicly identify me as somebody who served in Project Pegasus." So at least to his credit, he met with me, but then again, he did take the gutless position. In any case, I'm still hopeful that Bill will see the light and embrace my truth campaign, because my campaign is founded on truth, the truth derived from personal experience. A chief project scientist on Project Pegasus, Dr. Sterling Colgate, who was then, this is a much later picture, a recent picture of Sterling. He was then the president of the New Mexico Institute of Science and Technology, which is also known as New Mexico Tech. Back in the project days in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a building adjacent to where the research library at New Mexico Tech now stands. It was C-shaped and maybe about the size of an insurance company agency office in Albuquerque, just a small kind of New Mexico building, C-shaped. And you would walk through the zero-scaped courtyard there and go into the lobby and get access at a security desk with an armed and badged guard for the federal government to be granted access to the left side of the building. It was on that left side of the building where advanced graduate students of New Mexico Tech in physics, under Dr. Colgate, who had initially been the chair of physics at New Mexico Tech and then president of New Mexico Tech, were processing images from the future. Colgate developed the plasma confinement chamber and plasma confinement technology, by which I was sent to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania from 1972 to November 19th of 1863 for the express purpose of seeing Abraham Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. Now, that's quite a claim. I'm also claiming that my father stated that Colgate was a scion of the Colgate-Palmolive fortune, a family member of the Colgates, and that pardon me, Colgate was secretly funding Project Pegasus on behalf of the U.S. Defense Technical Community. Well, let's just focus on New Mexico Tech, Sterling Colgate, and plasma confinement. Before, as you'll see in my discussion of the technologies, I take you to East Hanover, New Jersey, where he and my father used plasma confinement to send me to Gettysburg. Let's just go to now briefly to the Socorro, New Mexico campus of New Mexico Tech. Before I visited that establishment in September of 2004 with my friend Dixie from Vancouver, Washington, I said I had been in time travel activities with a physicist from New Mexico Tech named Sterling Colgate, and that he was administering the time travel technology based on plasma confinement. And that I had also seen how he was administering the photo analysis of images from the future on that secured left side of that C-shaped building. That was an Aerojet Corporation facility on the New Mexico Tech campus. During my September 2004 trip to New Mexico, I established that he had been the chair of physics there. He had been the president of New Mexico Tech. His name was Colgate. And then I went into the special collections there at the research library, and Joy Thompson, who was the head research librarian, who was then dying of cancer from playing in nuclear tailings as a young child growing up in Los Alamos, and was ready to shoot the moon and help any independent researcher coming through New Mexico. Joy, who I could also dedicate this talk to, took me into the special collections, took out the Sterling Colgate clip file, and there was the article from February of 1972 announcing that that night Dr. Sterling Colgate, president of New Mexico Tech, would give a talk on plasma confinement. Okay, so I just cite that as one anecdote, one form of factual corroboration of my memories. I have dozens, indeed I now have hundreds of such anecdotes. How could somebody who grew up in New Jersey, and then California, and then moved to the Northwest, and then moved back to California, and then moved to England to go to graduate school, and then came back to California, and then moved to Washington, and then moved to Hawaii, which I'm doing during this trip, how could I somehow get hold of that specific concatenation of facts any other way than having experienced it? How could alien abduction, advanced psychic performance, deja vu, synchronicity, a good guess, LSD administration by the CIA under Project Naomi or whatever, Project MK Ultra, how could any other means have put that specific stem of facts in my mind? It had to have been by meeting Colgate and working with him. So in my research disc from that trip, I've got the JPEGs of that, literally from the New Mexico Institute of Science and Technology research library. So they haven't been hiding their time travel secrets very well. If a civilian lawyer, a civilian who happens to be a lawyer as well from Washington State, waltzes into their research library and they give me Sterling Colgate's clip file, and one of the time travel technologies isn't cited in a public newspaper article. I mean, that, as Alfred knows, under the laws of evidence, in both at the federal and all the state levels, newspaper articles are either ancient documents if they're over 20 years old, or they're self-authenticating because they're a publication and hence come into evidence as they overcome the threshold problem of hearsay or chain of custody of the evidence or whatever. So here we have admissible evidence that Sterling Colgate was working on plasma confinement in the early 70s, as I had alleged before I went to New Mexico Tech in the present to investigate my experiences. So he's a major fish. Not only have I sought him out, I've literally been at his kitchen table talking to his wife. And she said, oh, well, yeah, Sterling did a lot of classified things from the government, but you're not going to hear about any of them from Sterling, you know. And this disturbed individual, I'll just call him Kevin, who has been retracing some of my experiences, this stalker, has also been stalking Sterling Colgate. In fact, I basically turned my stalker, and now he's on Sterling Colgate's case. So you have to do these things when you're researching your experience in U.S. time travel. I would be remiss not to discuss Ed Dames again. If there is one person on this planet besides myself who can break the time travel cover-up and the Mars visitation cover-up by the United States, it is Major Ed Dames. Ed worked with me in the Montauk chair in New Mexico during one of my hidden summers in New Mexico. Basically, when I went back and reestablished my timeline, I think I drifted from this point. I basically spent the summer of 70 teleporting back and forth to New Mexico, back to New Jersey with the other kids. Then, in the beginning of the summer of 71, I teleported there with my father. We spent the entire summer there and then teleported back to the beginning of the summer and lived a different summer of 71. Then as we progressed into, I was doing the physical thing here, away from the microphone, unfortunately. But then as we progressed into the fall of 71, we then jumped forward in time and pre-experienced the summer of 73, and then jumped back to the fall of 71. And that's when my mother received a call from me from New Mexico that I was down in the rec room when she received. Okay? In fact, somebody said recently on Facebook, wait a minute, Andy, if you'd gone up in the kitchen where your mom had the phone, you would be able to talk to yourself on the phone in real time. And I said, yeah, I didn't think of that. Neat, you know. But no, so I was actually in the rec room when the call arrived 3 weeks after we teleported back to New Mexico, which was a call that I had placed 3 weeks after we arrived via teleportation in summer of 73. Now this remains a mysterious incident. It may have been a spiritual incident rather than a technical one, because somebody pointed out something quite valid, and I don't view it as a threat to validity because I lived it. I mean, my dad actually yelled at me for placing a call from the rental house or summer sublet in White Rock. I wasn't supposed to be getting on the phone when I was quantum displaced in New Mexico. I placed that call in the summer of 73 to my parents' phone, which was 201-539-4948 in our home in Morris Plains. It's now the 973 area code. I tried to call it to see if my mother would answer, but I got an answering machine, so she wasn't there, unfortunately. So anyway, I placed that call from summer of 73 in New Mexico. My mom received it in fall of 71, but there's a problem. We moved from that house in November of 72, and that number would have been reassigned or just archived in the New Jersey Bell telephone system. So how did my 1973 phone call reach my mother in fall of 71? So that she could answer it 3 weeks after we returned to New Jersey, after I placed it 3 weeks after arriving via teleportation in New Mexico. The explanation that I've derived, I think, may go to the heart of what they were doing when they were using teleportation between timelines. We jumped from 1971 to 73. But wait a minute, I lived 1973 in a whole new original way when we moved in November of 72 to Southern California. I spent the summer of 73 basically jumping in and out of swimming pools and going to Zuma Beach all day. So I didn't live 1973 in New Mexico during the second time, but I lived that summer of 73 in New Mexico after we jumped there from 71 and then jumped back. I think the explanation is that we weren't jumping from 1971 to 73. We were jumping from our alpha timeline to alpha prime. In other words, it was a 1973 that was kind of like an emanation of the original timeline, but not the 1973 that we were ultimately causally connected to on our alpha timeline. Because that's like calling into a next room at that point, right, rather than across time. Because that phone call shouldn't have been placeable. It was basically like one of those phantom phone calls, like where people have a loved one who get killed accidentally, you know, in an accident, and they get a phone call, you know, an hour after they were supposed to have perished in a train wreck or something. But that happened, and there's still no explanation for it, unless it literally yields a new understanding, which is that when we jumped from fall of 71 to the beginning of summer of 73, it wasn't the summer of 73 as we later understood it. It was like an emanation of the penumbra of 71. It was like attached to it in a way that an ordinary timeline isn't. So that's the best I can do. But she answered. In fact, she didn't believe that I had called, and she said, "Don't fool your mother like this. I know that you're right here in the house." But then she thought about it. When my dad came home from work, she said, "Ray, something very strange happened in the house today." He said, "What, hon?" And he said, "I got a call from Andy." I said, "So? Well, maybe he was out at a neighbor's house or something." She said, "No, he was in the house." I said, "So? Maybe he ran next door to the Harrises or the Connors and just played a prank on you, hon." And no, my mom said, no, Ray, he was down in the rec room. I took the phone and went down there and looked at him. He was sitting there in the rec room and I was talking to him on the phone. And my dad said, "Maybe he was using another phone, honey." My mom said, "No, Ray, we only have one phone." And he and I were on it, but he wasn't on a phone. And Dad said, "Oh, maybe it was one of those psychic things." So, of course, he didn't tell her that I was being involved in every form of time travel, from psychic, from clairvoyance to physical to teleportation, back and forth between New Jersey and New Mexico. So people without a need to know were being deceived. My mother was being deceived. I was trained to deceive my mother. I do feel bad about that. There were times when she almost got to the truth of what was happening. When I first tried to tell her, and this may be actually why I'm having these respiratory difficulties, when I first tried to tell her, I had been threatened by this strange-looking kid as I was walking home from school, that if I ever told anybody about what we were doing in Project Pegasus, they would kill my mother, they would kill my whole family. So after my mother was doing her ironing one day, I tried to tell her, but my voice was actually completely constricted. Because think of the consequences I was 8 at that time, to an 8-year-old. You're thinking if you tell your mother something, she might be killed for you telling her. So it literally had almost like this instinctive lock on my vocal cords, unlike anything I've had before or since. And it prevented me from telling my mom that my dad and I were involved in time travel. So in one of those 3 hidden summers, it was 71, 73, or 72, Ed Dames was working with me in the Montauk chair in one of the underground labs in New Mexico. And this may be one of the reasons for his concealment. He was giving me a small metabolite of mescaline to space me out in the Montauk chair to see if that would effectuate a deeper understanding of the subjective moments in the future that I was quantum accessing via the Montauk chair. I'll describe a little bit later what the Montauk chair is, but Ed worked with me directly. He was a young sort of postdoc, about 25, 26 years old, blonde hair, a white jacket. I remember he used to wear cowboy boots and drive a motorcycle. But I remember I asked him whether his name was Danes, and he said, well, I think I had some Danish ancestors back there in my family tree, but it's actually Dames with an M. And he would take me through these exercises in the Montauk chair and then debrief me, just as the ladies from DARPA had back in New Jersey. During some of those debriefings, after I'd been sent to subjective moments in my own future, he told me, well, what did you see? And I said, President John F. Kerry. Now, I announced that as a fait accompli before Bush defeated Kerry in 2004. Or actually, Kerry defeated Bush and then was prevented from taking his office in a coup d'etat by the Bush administration. But, let me have some licorice here. But Ed said, did you say President John F. Kerry? And I said, yeah. You didn't say President John F. Kennedy. Said, no, President John F. Kerry. I now believe that wasn't me seeing John F. Kerry as president, but seeing him during a presidential campaign whistle stop in Portland, Oregon, that I attended with some of my friends from Portland. Because in the Montauk chair, you're only accessing your own subjective experience. President John F. Kerry isn't in my subjective experience because he was denied taking the office that he had won. But I did see him when he was, double digits ahead of Bush in Portland with Howard Dean and a few other Democrats. And so that's what I must have seen, was that episode in the future, because that's the only time I've seen John F. Kerry. Ed also taught the Mars training course that I attended at the College of the Siskiyous in Weed, California. I don't know if they selected that place name for its hallucinogenic implications. In Weed, I think it's because they had selected Mount Shasta as where they were going to put the Houston, Texas of time-space, which was a brilliant idea. It's a beautiful part of the world. But he taught our Mars training course, which took place in the last 2 weeks in August and the first week in September of 1980. And just not to telegraph my address on Thursday, but too much, but in that training program, that training class, which was basically just a set of factual lectures that Ed gave, this is a direct quote. He said, of the 97,000 people we have thus far put on Mars, only 7,000 have survived after 5 years. So Ed is not just a deep Defense Department insider who's been buffaloing everybody for decades on the Art Bell Show and now Coast to Coast with the kill shot from the sun and first-degree murder cases that he's working on as a psychic with SciTech. He is one of the architects of what I call the high-sci disinformation ploy, which is not to say that remote viewing or technical remote viewing aren't legitimate enterprises in and of themselves. They're an important part of the emergence of time travel, and much was done by the U.S. military and intelligence community in just using human psychic ability to view things at a distance. The problem is that that's all they talk about. They never address time travel technology. You don't even need a human psychic if you have chronovision. I mean, if you have to determine whether the Soviet president has cancer, you're going to use chronovision to look inside his oncologist's office, not a psychic. I mean, a psychic is fuzzy logic compared to an electro-optical device that can tune in that place in time and space. Okay, so the high-side disinformation ploy is not to assert that remote viewing is not legitimate in and of itself. It's to constantly emphasize it as all that was done. If, for example, you take a great work about the remote viewing program, like Jim Schnabel's seminal work back in 1989, when all of the remote viewers like Joe Magano, and they were, legitimate figures in psychic research, Ingo Swann, when all of those people came forward, they were basically asserting tacitly that the only form of quantum access that the U.S. military and intelligence community had ever involved itself in was remote viewing. But in fact, as you'll see today, by 1970, there were multiple forms of time travel that had emerged that we weren't being told about, while they were overemphasizing remote viewing. So I'm not criticizing these individuals. I admire their work. They've made a profound contribution to the noetic sciences, but we now have to widen the discussion to include the fact that as of 1970, there were machines to engage in technical remote viewing. You may recall, those of you who are devotees of the field of remote viewing, you may recall that it was Major Dames on the old Art Bell show who described technical remote viewing as a form of using the matrix and plotting basically a conventional remote viewing space that you then start filling in, usually with a guide working with the psychic, with the remote viewer. Well, technical remote viewing is chronovision. It's using technology, right? That's just a form of advanced remote viewing he was talking about, and he was calling it technical remote viewing. I assert that technical remote viewing is the chronovision technology that the Defense Department, Parsons, GE, Bell Labs evolved from the early work of Ernetti, Gemelli, and Fermi. So, unlike some of the project participants who haven't been disinformationists, Ed has really got to come clean with us and say, look, Andy's telling the truth. We achieved time travel in 1970, and by 1980, we had already gotten 97,000 people on Mars via one of those technologies. That's the minimum requirement that I'm going to hold him to. Okay, so what were the technologies themselves? We see that there's been this historical cover-up. The first is remote viewing. I was involved in remote viewing experiments for the U.S. Navy. In one of them, frequently a team leader was leading us through the remote viewing, and there was often a lieutenant commander from the U.S. Navy who was then gathering the results. In one of those exercises, they held up the ensign commissioning photograph of Lieutenant John McCain, and they told us that, here's John, take a good look at him. Here's a building that we think he's being kept in somewhere in the world, where bad people are keeping him. They didn't give us any information about the fact that he was a naval aviator being held as a POW in Vietnam. And it must have been, from street view, a line drawing of the Hanoi Hilton, the POW compound that Senator McCain was being held in. And they said, we know you kids are very psychic. Frequently you'll tell your parents about a news event that occurs later, or read your parents' minds and converse with them about it. Between now and next Tuesday at 10 in the morning, we want you to go home and dream about where John is. And we want you to know, is he in this building? And if so, where is he in the building? So I went home and I had about 3 or 4 lucid dreams in the early morning hours in that next week. And I saw John McCain, young Lieutenant McCain, being frog marched through hallways, being suspended from his elbows in a dark room on a hook, and being left to pass into unconsciousness from the god-awful pain. And I saw him being taken in an earthen hallway that his captors had dug under the building. Okay, so this is let's say the Hanoi Hilton from plan view, and when we met again the next week, I and one of the girls in the program were explaining that his captors had dug an earthen hallway from the front to the back of the compound under the concrete pedestal or pediment in the foundation of the building, and had shoved him into this cage where he couldn't stand up and there were thin bars. So not knowing what we were saying, we were literally revealing to the Office of Naval Intelligence that the son of the commander of the Pacific Fleet, John McCain Sr., was being kept in a small cage under the Hanoi Hilton. why would that make sense? Well, he was obviously a high priority POW to be protected from U.S. airstrikes by the North Vietnamese because his father was a commander of the Pacific Fleet. He was the ultimate bargaining chip, the ultimate compromised POW, even for just for propaganda value. And obviously, we would have tried to either liberate or kill our POWs by bombing them. And in fact, we ultimately did begin bombing around our POW or their POW compounds to try to liberate our captive aviators and soldiers. I've made several attempts to speak with Senator McCain, most recently when he came through Oregon on his presidential run, and he has refused my inquiries. I really just want to talk to him and say, do you know that your dad was even using child psychics in New Jersey to find you? You know, how does that reformulate your personal map, you know, your reality? Because he did go through hell over there. I mean, he basically is permanently physically disabled from having things done to him, like being suspended by his elbows and having his shoulder joints pop out of position and so forth. I really just want to connect with him because when I looked at his picture as a kid growing up in New Jersey, I think he was born of an Irish father, if I'm not mistaken, and an Italian mom. And I really identified with him as a kid growing up in a predominantly Irish and Italian Catholic neighborhood in New Jersey. I kind of saw him as one of the kids from the neighborhood. And so I tried to reach out to him and say, you know, I think we found you. Were you in fact put in this tiger cage in an earthen hallway underneath the building? Because that's what I and one of the other child remote viewers for the Navy told the Office of Naval Intelligence in the fall of 1969. But I've yet been able to reach him personally. I think what I'll probably do is write a letter and just see if he responds to it. Maybe if I'm elected president, he'll come by the White House and we can talk about it. Have a cup of coffee, as Hubert Humphrey used to say. Okay. So, hold on. Now, that's about all we did. We just did a couple of basically rudimentary naval intelligence functions as remote viewers. What I can offer to the remote viewing field is that it did not begin at Stanford Research Institute in 1972. They were utilizing children's, not just the adults that have now come forward. And we began remote viewing for the Office of Naval Intelligence in fall of 1969. What the disinformation does almost all the time is it always states that the former Soviet Union was ahead and we were always 2 or 3 years behind. In fact, as in all of these areas of time travel technology yielding quantum access to past and future events, we were several steps ahead of the KGB in remote viewing and even had children looking for high priority POWs by fall of '69. The second methodology, the most rudimentary form of time travel, is an ancient occult practice. It produces astral time travel, which I define as psychic travel in non-ordinary realms of existence. So in the same way that remote viewing allows you to astrally travel in ordinary realms of existence, if you spin somebody, not just a child, but anybody who can be trained in this, basically if you lay somebody flat on their back on a tabletop-like device and you spin them clockwise at 33 rotations per minute, again, that'll excite the conspiracy theorists because that's what the highest stage of Freemasonry is, 33rd degree. It was also the speed of many of our conventional records when the record industry evolved after World War II. But if you spin somebody at 33 rotations as they're looking up at a spiral image on the ceiling, and you train them to basically relax the active mind and just let their eyes blur out looking at the spiral, what happens is the person falls into immediate unconsciousness, very brief unconsciousness, and then you have a kind of like a kind of a feathery kind of falling sensation, almost like you're falling into a bed of pillows, and then you pop out of your body and you go up and up and up and up and up and up. Okay, so this was done for us to then be later debriefed about what we saw when we were out of body. They wanted us to develop the ability to just be standing there and just spring out of our bodies and go somewhere. After one of those exercises where I went OBE after I was spun, which I took to pretty easily. I think I had propensities to being dissociative. Now, on my mother's lineage, we were descendants of Prussians who had survived and in fact distinguished themselves in combat during the 30 Years' War. Well, in the 30 Years' War, something like 1/3 of the European population died. Imagine what the die-off rate was in Central Europe, where most of the battle was, like in Germany and Czechoslovakia and Poland and so forth. There was probably a die-off of like 90% of the population. Well, one thing we know from the bloodlines, for example, the survivors of the potato famine in Ireland, the survivors of that 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, their lineage, is that the same individuals who have high psychic potential also freely dissociate. Okay, so for example, if you think how you're going to survive a famine or a war, you're going to be the intuitive person who knows where the bread is if you've been starving for 3 weeks, right? Or what not to say to that person, that soldier who could kill you if you say the wrong thing. And you're also going to be able to dissociate and, for example, not notice your hunger pains, right? I mean, in the 30 Years' War, German peasants were following the battle just to barbecue the animals that were dying during the conflict. So there are specific European bloodlines that the CIA knew about, that Hitler and Himmler had been studying when they joined the Thule Society, from the time they joined the Thule Society in 1919, that entered the CIA through the Reinhard Gehlen / Operation Paperclip network. So I was one of those individuals because I had that Prussian German on my mother's side and also some Florentine Italian on my mother's side. So my matrilineal DNA wasn't Illuminati, but it was, it was psychic. It was what the Italians call having a strega, which isn't witchcraft, it's psychic ability. Okay, so they were studying a group of Italian and German kids in this component of the program. So after one of those OBEs, I'm going out of body and I reach basically a physical limit to the hologram that I was moving through astrally. It looked like I was a little fly inside of a movie projector, like a video, like a holodeck. I reached a literal physical limit, even though I think Jean-Luc's works actually take us through portals that pierce that physical limit and take us into metaphysical realms of experience directly. In these OBEs, I actually reached a terminus that I couldn't get beyond, and I went back down and into my body. I was then debriefed by a health teacher from a local middle school who had been an Army nurse during the war. They were using Army veterans and National Guard enlisted regularly through the school system in these support positions. And she said, okay, Andy, what did you see this time? I think What Did You See, in fact, became the title of Ed Dame's, Tell Me What You Saw, became the title of Ed's autobiography, which is appropriate. So this individual, Stephanie Bindis, said, okay, Andy, tell me what you saw. And I described reaching the limits to this hologram that we find ourselves in. And she said, yes, we think that's the physical limit to the hologram that we find ourselves in. Other people are reporting it. We're calling it the Matrix. So this is 10 years, 15 years before the Wachowski brothers do the Matrix trilogy. I think it demonstrates that a lot of these ideas and discoveries from the secret classified defense realm are being distributed through the mass media. In the same way, for example, the first episode of Stargate Atlantis was called Project Pegasus. Really? So I take umbrage with that because I was in the real one. Okay, so anyway, she said we're calling it the Matrix. It was later confirmed for me by Dr. Eldon Bird, who at one point was one of the top scientists working for the US Navy. He passed away in 2002. But he was helping me during my early effort to figure out what had happened. And Eldon said, well, that makes sense because, in fact, we're living in a machine that generates a hologram. It may be a sanctified essence. It may be a very beautiful universe that's created in that machine. But at least it was a finding made by the defense technical community in the early 70s that the cosmos we inhabit is a simulation. I don't mean to threaten anybody's existential sense of reality or religious belief or physics, but that's what they said. I don't know if it's true. I mean, perhaps the universe is just one big idea that goes on forever, but the Navy had concluded that we're actually living in a super chronovisor, a multidimensional hologram with multiple timelines that is ultimately being generated by a physical infrastructure. Carl Sagan was lying to us. There aren't billions and billions of stars in the cosmos. There are billions and billions of simulated stars that we experience when we look at the part of the hologram that is programmed star. I hate to say it, it sounds very technicist, because I do think the world and the cosmos is a sanctified essence, but it's still being produced by a device. That was their finding. Now, people have asked me, does that mean that the timelines going through the quantum hologram are finite? Well, not necessarily. If water keeps on falling into a finite basin infinitely, is that a finite or an infinite experience? The basin, the viaduct can be finite, but if the water keeps on being replenished, it's infinite, right? So I think that's in fact what's going on. An infinite series of event scenarios called timelines is constantly coursing through a device that the great Imagineer developed to propagate this universe. So if that helps you on your way to arriving at your own conclusions about quantum physics, that's what I can provide from the project. Maybe they were being deceived. Maybe they reached the wrong conclusion. Maybe when we were going out of body, there was just some physical limit to how far we could go. But anyway, that's what they said. In the U.S. defense technical community secretly, by 1970, was the so-called Montauk chair. When I was a child in Project Pegasus, it was simply called the chair. The chair was present in the learning lab where I was receiving specialized instruction to be involved in Project Pegasus. As I mentioned, the Mount View Road Elementary School, a public grammar school in suburban Cedar Knolls, New Jersey. Very close to my family's residence in Morris Plains, New Jersey. And we were sequestered there in an old art studio of the elementary school. And a technician would come in and set up this chair. Let me describe it. Again, I'm going to have a draftsman do high quality drawings, schematics of these devices. I have not yet commissioned those. But I think it's readily describable. The Montauk chair was a chair. It was like a dental chair in the sense that it was semi-recumbent, kind of like you would be sitting in a space capsule where you're allowed to sort of rest halfway back, but not completely on your back. Above your head was an umbrella like a photographer's umbrella. Behind your solar plexus, attached to the back of the chair, was a device that my father later explained was a magnetic transducer. He was obviously an electrical engineer, so he also called it a solenoid. But it was a magnetic transducer that generated some kind of electromagnetic or gravitic field into your solar plexus chakra, which may very well be the one that controls your position in time-space. And at our feet was a fishhook-like metal extension arm that had a brown tube on it that I believe was a cathode ray tube. Hence, it was emitting some kind of energy at our heads. Headsets would be placed on our ears, a cotton mask over our eyes with colored light diodes placed over the cotton mask. And when the device was, we weren't buckled in or anything, we were just reclining on this chair. And there was also a computer processing unit underneath the chair. That was the first time I ever heard the acronym CPU for computer processing unit. Dr. David Lewis Anderson, one of my good friends and esteemed colleagues in the time travel research field, who in fact will be announcing at the Pythagoras conference that we've had discussions about the fact that we're both going to call for the development of a time-space agency inside the U.S. government, at least inside a branch of the U.S. government, to work on the declassification and the deployment of these technologies. But you may recall that Dr. Anderson, who, unlike myself, has signed contemporary security oaths, where, like my father, a lot of these engineers have agreed basically to be assassinated if they violate their secrecy and loyalty oaths. So, for example, when I asked David to appear in Santa Fe with me to call on Bill Richardson and Donald Rumsfeld to reveal what they know about our... David appeared on the Old Art Bell show and stated something that I found, I literally fell out of my chair when I heard it. I was listening, just working on a document at my computer. And he stated the God's honest truth, which was that in 2002, the Montauk chair went national and involved thousands of American schoolchildren. He stated that in 2002, but I may have misspoken, that in 1970, the Montauk chair went national and involved thousands of American schoolchildren. I thought, well, wait a minute. That's the right year, because we first started to be trained in the Learning Lab in fall of 1969, and it was in that spring of that first year that the man would come to the Learning Lab and set up the Montauk chair. The Montauk chair achieved a form of time travel that I think could best be described as psycho-spiritual. Because what happened is, when they turned the device on, presumably the magnetic transducer on the back of the Montauk chair was hitting your solar plexus with something. Probably some kind of magnetic effect. I don't know, I'm not a physicist. But I do know what happened, which is I would hear a syncopated chaos of, or cacophony of syncopated sound and light tones. In other words, the lights would start flashing in a mathematically consistent way, not just chaotic flashing, but almost like a light show where lights are being used to responsively to like a work of classical music or something. So in an ordered way, the lights would start flashing in different colors. And when they did, we would hear through our headsets a sound that sounded something like this. Please don't laugh, but it's it sounded like this. It was kind of a syncopated sound of computerized tones, as if you had programmed some work of jazz with a computer synthesizer. I couldn't do that because of my throat, but basically a set of like sort of syncopated musical tones. After about 30 seconds or 60 seconds of that combination of light and sound, at least I can tell you what I experienced, which is I would lift out of my body and start moving through different dimensions of the quantum plenum, almost like somebody riding a luge. In other words, feet first, primarily on my back. And I would see something on the horizon that looked like maybe nondescript buildings that had been painted in with black ink or something. And that object would get closer and closer, faster and faster, and then I would collide with it, and I would find myself in a subjective moment of my own future. In other words, the Montauk chair allows you to pre-experience episodes of your own personal experience. The benefit of that was that when we were debriefed, we could be questioned about what we had experienced in the future. So the debriefer from DARPA would say something like, okay, you were in a room. Was the television set on? Yes. Well, who was on television? The President of the United States. Oh, really? What was the President of the United States saying? The President of the United States was giving the State of the Union address. Oh, really? Who was the President of the United States? Barack Obama. Okay, they said, who? Barack Obama. So they were using our subjective experience of reality in the future as prompted by this magnetic transducer to go on sort of fishing expeditions in the future and gather information about the future in a collateral way. This chair is called the Montauk chair because even though we were using it in Project Pegasus by spring of '70, Preston Nichols and Peter Moon have published a series of books establishing, or at least claiming, that by the early 1980s, it was essentially the thrust of the U.S. time-space program. It was not. It was only one. The Montauk chair was only one of 8 time travel devices in the U.S. time travel arsenal. Now, the information that I derived from the future, well, let me just say that one time I asked the young man, the postdoc, who would come into the lab and set up or knock down a device, how could we be time traveling to the future in this particular device if it's not going anywhere? And his answer was, we don't know. All we know is that the magnetic transduction from the device either prompts your conception of the future based on your future being programmed in your brain from birth, or alternatively, the explanation is environmental, not personal. That is to say that it triggers time waves that are out there in the future that contain packets of information that ultimately over time become your experience of events in the future. So we would go on these rides, these Montauk, these astral projections prompted by the chair. And just to show you how accurate it was, let me give you the context here. I'm growing up in New Jersey. I have one aunt or uncle west of Philadelphia, namely my Uncle Ed is living in Santa Barbara. I have only been west of Philadelphia via teleportation. I have no family member, no aunt or uncle, parent, sibling, any ancestor that had ever practiced law that I've been able to find. I had clearly never been to the Pacific Northwest and really didn't distinguish Seattle from San Antonio. And coming back to the learning lab from where the Montauk chairs were one afternoon after one of the rides for the future, young David, who was one of my contemporaries in the program, said to me, we're walking along kind of like little boys and maybe like a cartoon in the New Yorker by William Hamilton. And he said to me, so who were you this time? And I said, I was a lawyer in Seattle. So that's pretty good because, as I said, I had never been to the Northwest. Her ethnicity, which was Italian-American, just a physical description of her, and a statement of the friendship that I have, you know, as family members with that brother and sister-in-law, which is very close. And that was 8 years before my brother met my sister-in-law at Loyola Marymount University as college students. Since then, I've had moments of astonishing deja vu, like this conference, at least a couple moments where I've got some chills here at this conference, because I was pre-experiencing these little packets of these little episodes of my subjective future. And when I have them, it manifests as a deja vu experience because I pre-experienced these moments. So I would like to thank Joan for inviting me to speak here and confirm for her that this is one of those cosmic moments that I accessed as a child in Project Pegasus, because I recognize the event, and many of you beautiful people have come here under the good graces of Joan and John Lick. So in that way, they were gathering information, and to the extent that what I saw of my own future lent data points like my sister-in-law's identity, like my professional identity and location at midlife as a lawyer from Washington, you know, practicing in Washington, John F. Kerry being a political person of interest. It makes perfect sense that they spun off the Montauk chair and developed Project Montauk to push the potentialities of the Montauk chair. One of its benefits, obviously, was that the time traveler's body didn't go anywhere, and that it would certainly eliminate the danger and the liability of sending somebody in time-space. But it was certainly more enhanced than just sitting a psychic across the table and asking them what they saw inside the Kremlin. So the Montauk chair exists. Project Montauk also, I would say probably, the Montauk chair exists because I traveled to the future in it in Project Pegasus. Another interesting data point in the books about the Montauk Project by Nichols and Moon is they identify a man by the name of Jack Pruitt as the research director for Project Montauk, which, since I know that my timeline is reliable, Montauk followed Pegasus. Jack Pruitt was a team leader on Project Pegasus that I first met in summer of 1967 after kindergarten and last met with in Santa Fe during my June 2003 trip to New Mexico. Jack Pruitt is quietly and even covertly one of the heroes of the rollout as well, because he was risking his life, and his son Glenn presumably was. Glenn has now died at a very advanced weight. He may have been one of the teleportees whose metabolic system was affected by the experience, by the energy fields. But Jack signed the same security oaths that my father signed, and I believe that when he met with me in June of 2003 in Santa Fe, he may very well have been risking his life. So I'd like to salute Jack Pruitt for covertly meeting with me and informing me that there was an initial finding that the child teleportees, some of them were breaking down metabolically and getting very heavy, so that I should, for example, he advised me to pursue caloric restriction. And I really haven't been counting calories, but I've gone pretty low glycemic, just cutting my carbs just to avoid getting too heavy. I'm a little bit overweight now, but I think now that I'm moving here to Hawaii, I can drop some more weight. But that has been a problem. Now, some of the time-space pioneers for the U.S. government have battled substantial weight problems, which can often not be very pretty. So Jack, I think, is to be saluted for just even talking to me. That was a courageous act on his part. And he was not deceiving me. He was collaborating, helping me sort out what happened, which I think is definitely a blessing from Jack. Again, one of the things I found in life, but not in my investigation, is it totally pays off to never pigeonhole other people and never presume any negativity from them. Because people that you pigeonhole as a kook or the maintainer of a cult or your enemy in your field or in any area of human life, in my time travel, in my truth campaign, they become my allies. So I could have pigeonholed Jack as, oh, he's one of those assholes from the project who won't talk to me. He's just going to blow me off like Richardson did, like Rumsfeld did. The man met with me at the risk of his own life and his son's life. So you can't pigeonhole, because you always have to allow humanity and the universe to help you, and often it comes through the graces of people that, just in our own egotism, we presume are either neutral or hostile to us. And Jack ended up being one of the heroes of my investigation. As did Courtney Hunt of the CIA. I mean, I could have pigeonholed Courtney as the cigarette-smoking man from the CIA, which he surely was, but he spent 20 years covertly slipping information to me, and he wasn't supposed to be doing that. So he's also one of the heroes of my truth campaign. Okay, so that was the Montauk chair. It's basically a magnetic transducer. My question to everybody here is, don't you think that if somebody's stuck in some kind of mental problem like depression, they should have access to the therapeutic benefits of a device like this? Let's say their marriage has just ended, they've lost a loved one, a child perhaps. Imagine the therapeutic benefit if you could sit in the Montauk chair for an hour and visit your life 10 years in the future and find that you had remarried if you had lost your spouse, or you had more children, or adopted if you had lost a baby, or you were working in some creative field if you had lost your job. This kind of use of quantum access as a healing modality has been kept back from everybody, and that's another reason that I'm speaking out. I think it would have tremendous psychiatric benefits, maybe even just to do it on a limited access basis. Maybe everybody would get 3 hours a year in the chair, but you couldn't map your own future because then that would help you too much on the stock market or whatever. Maybe you could have a license from the Department of Moving People where you could have 3 hours in the Montauk. Okay, the fourth chronovisor device that was fully operational by 1970 was the Tesla teleporter. I mentioned how the nodes were Curtiss Wright Aeronautical in Woodridge, and then the Santa Fe State Capitol ground. From Santa Fe, we would be taken ultimately during that day, week, month, or summer, back to the Sandia National Labs, where there was not only an identical device, there was an identical room down to the linoleum floor tile and the Dixie cup and the number 2, freshly sharpened number 2 Eberhard Faber pencil on the windowsill. And I always used to ask them, why do you have that pencil and that Dixie cup on the windowsill? And they would never tell me. Maybe it was because it was in the room at Curtiss Wright when the technician walked through the energy field and spontaneously teleported to Africa. I wondered whether that was like a long-standing joke to me, that my friend Dixie would become the investor in my book project and help me write the book, because she's been my major ally in the way that Alfred and Ware have been. But Dixie has sustained me during my writing of the passages for my book in 2005, somewhat financially, and she was my co-adventurer during the second fact-finding trip when we found the toy that I had left at the old school site in Lamy. So I think that might have been a little bit of a sight gag there from my dad or other people on the project. Remember, Andy, when you have that number 2 pencil in your hand, your friend Dixie's going to be over your right shoulder, as she has been. So I'd like to dedicate this talk also to Dixie. The teleport was not dependent on ley lines and other natural formations. I'm often asked, well, did they select that spot because you had to put that device there to open up that natural stargate or that ley line? That never came up when I was on the project. And we were educated in the structure, the function, the provenance of these devices, and that idea never came up. What did come up is that you had to turn the teleporter on by plugging it into the wall. They were thinking, as Rumsfeld said during the meeting, of continuing to keep it secret as a military technology. One of the limits of that was that you can't teleport people into areas where there is water. For example, the U.S. Navy SEALs and the Marines frequently invade or arrive at locations where water is present, either the ocean or rivers or bodies of water in fields and that type of thing. It was Rumsfeld's position and the position of the Defense Department that it should remain sequestered for its military potential. But we found in a really heart-rending incident in 1971 that if there was water present when you arrived, you could be physically harmed in a very serious way. In 1971, we were jumping into Santa Fe. It was actually an old abandoned junior high school site with kids from different teleports around the country. And the goal was to get there and run to the Bataan Memorial Building in Santa Fe before anybody else. It was almost like a race. And this was where they were rehearsing dropping us in, training us to be dropped in as child spies. For example, I was sent to a Parsons Projects location in Saudi Arabia during that time frame. So they were training us for espionage as child teleportees. And I ran past a public fountain in this public area, whether it was a junior high school or some kind of public buildings, and there in the fountain were the red Ked sneakers and the feet of one of the boys who had teleported in from one of the other project locations. And as I moved past the fountain, public fountain, I saw that he was writhing on the ground and he was already being pinned to the ground by one of the male team leaders, shouting in pain, my feet, what am I going to do without any feet? I'm only 9 years old. So I have one lead that person, that unfortunate young man may in fact have been in my team. Because there was one of the project kids from my team I did notice was walking as if he had been furnished with prosthetic feet before we left the program. I don't know if he was that individual. I didn't recognize him when he was injured. Presumably he survived because what happened was that the specific gravity of the water caused his feet right below the midpoint of the ankles to arrive later. So when he arrived essentially on top of the water, and his body slid off the top of his feet, just like when you cut a tree down. And he tumbled out of the fountain without his feet attached. And then two the female team leaders reached that location. They all had walkie-talkies near these areas where we were always teleporting into. And one of them grabbed me by the shoulder and running me out of the area screamed in my ear, "You didn't see this, Andy. It didn't happen. You didn't see this." I was then taken to a psychiatrist or doctor's office in Santa Fe, asked to drop my drawers, and given a huge injection in the left butt cheek with a sedative because they were telling me, we're going to have to calm you down, Andy. All I know, I was spaced out for the rest of the day. My father arrived. He took me to one of the restaurants that we would frequent in Albuquerque from Santa Fe, and there was a discussion among the adults on the project connected to my father about the mishap that had happened up at the state capitol grounds. Actually, it had to have been in the state capitol grounds because I now remember one of the project engineers said to my dad, I understand one of the kids lost his feet up at the state capitol grounds today, Ray? My dad didn't even want to hear it. He was looking up at a baseball game. And then he finally yelled, yeah, so shut up about it. I mean, my dad was really disturbed that this child had been injured unnecessarily because it had to have resulted from inadvertence or actual malfeasance inside the project because they should have made sure that the area that we were teleporting into didn't have any standing bodies of water. So my dad, being a good guy and an honest guy and a compassionate man, was very disturbed that this incident had happened. And I asked him what was going to happen to the child involved. And he said, well, he'll be pensioned and furloughed out of the project. And you children have all been insured. Your families have been insured for $1 million for the loss of your life and $100,000 for each limb. So he'll be outfitted with prosthetic feet and then be pensioned at $200,000, which those were $1971, but that's not a huge amount of money for losing your feet at age 9. And that informs the outrage that I feel. I mean, I time traveled for Richard Nixon. I didn't even get this shirt. So here this poor child lost his feet for life, at least the connectivity. And that is it's a travesty. It's a sacrilege that he wasn't paid more and that it even happened. It was clearly a mistake. But I am speaking out also because children that age paid very heavy, great prices so that we could develop these time travel technologies. Why not do the right thing and use them as best as we can to help everybody? I mean, if you're going to lose your feet, you might as well lose it in something that ultimately is used to benefit humanity, not to wage wars. And so another mishap happened directly to me, which is we jumped through the device in 1971, but when we got to the state capitol grounds in Santa Fe, we noticed a lot of things had changed. Walkways were in different locations. There was different treescape. Some of the buildings had been painted differently. And we ultimately realized that we had jumped accidentally to 1991. I also heard around this time that the girl had gone, well, I don't want to get into that technology, but there was another project injury that I'll describe. So my anger and my sense of injustice was fomenting here because I thought, this kid has lost his feet. I did ask my dad, Could that happen to me? And he says, yes, theoretically it could, but it doesn't. And I said, how do you know that, Dad? I mean, I could be injured or killed, right, doing these things? And he said, well, we know they don't. And I said, how do you know that? And he said, well, we've looked in the chronovisor, and we saw that you not only reach your 90s, but you're still working in your 90s. So I said, I am? And he said, yeah, we saw you in a courtroom giving an argument, and we determined you were 93 years old. And so I better, try to reach that. just to fulfill a fait accompli, as it were. So my dad did explain that I was going to be long-lived and that I was going to get through the project uninjured. I was injured in the project. I developed open sores all over my chest, shoulders, and back the year after I was dismissed from the project in 1972 that have now filled with keloid scars. So I always say to my skeptics, doubting Thomas, put his hands in Jesus' side when Jesus came back. If you want to touch my keloid scars and see that, probe my project injuries, have at it. Because I was medically injured, I have the scars to prove it. So I feel that I've earned my props establishing my claims when in fact I was physically injured during the project. Not severely, but, beg your pardon?
How did it happen?
After I left the project, open sores developed that were filled by, the keloid scarring process, where the dermis comes up and fills in the epidermis. I think it was probably from either the stress of being in the project and some combination of stress and the intense light from the advanced chronovisor program I'm going to describe next. That's my best guess. In terms of adult teleportees, I learned from Courtney Hunt that the adults who were teleporting were developing a heart valve defect. And in fact, my own father, who was regularly teleporting between New Jersey and New Mexico, he had a heart attack in 1977 and his first quadruple bypass in 1978. And his cardiac surgeon came out into the waiting room and said, did your dad ever have an infection involving the heart valves? And we said, well, he had scarlet fever when he was a child in Pennsylvania during the Depression. And he said, no, this is something much more unusual. His mitral valve is actually fused in like a butterfly flap, and is not closing properly. So my dad actually had to have a St. Jude's cuff, developed at Danny Thomas's hospital, I believe in St. Louis, Missouri, actually installed in his heart that you could hear clicking with his heartbeat, because his heart valve was fused in a kind of a butterfly formation that was not natural. So I believe my dad was actually one of the adult teleportees who did develop heart valve complications. I guess the reason for that is by midlife your tissues are more rigid, so that when we were teleporting, the vibratory effect was shoving the tissue together, where with a child there would be more flexibility in those kinds of cardiac tissues. I've had my heart examined and it's fine, so I don't believe that I suffer from that, but my dear old dad did. Okay, teleportation. Tesla works on it in 1899. It's in his papers at his death. There was something, I want to just briefly mention teleportation in the Philadelphia experiment. I have a paper on my website called The Real Philadelphia Experiment and the Philadelphia Experiment Cover Story. Something like the Philadelphia experiment happened during World War II, but all of the major facts have been changed to conceal what really happened. For example, it wasn't into invisibility of the Eldridge. It was undertaken to achieve Tesla teleportation of a ship called the Martha's Vineyard. It didn't take place in Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. It took place in Long Island Sound. It didn't involve the ship going back to Norfolk, Virginia. It went back to Newport News, Virginia. And in the Eldridge was not the redoubtable Cameron brothers, but two of the Manhattan Project scientists, J. Robert Oppenheimer and Edward Teller. My source for this is the late Dr. Robert Beckwith, one of the consulting engineers on Project Pegasus. He would regularly talk about the real Philadelphia experiment when I was a child on the project, and then later in the 2010s, he was interviewed twice by myself, once by Alexandra Bruce, and once by Ken Thomas of Steam Shovel Press, and his story about the real Philadelphia experiment held up. So that event happened, but he said, for example, well, when they wrote the cover story, when the Office of Naval Intelligence wrote the cover story, they included the element of various sailors being fused in the hull of the ship and everything. Actually, what he said happened is that one sailor was falling through time-space so that when the ship was brought back, not to Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, but to Long Island Sound. He was impaled through the midsection by a column of the splash cowling protecting the cabin's, the captain's mast, the center part of the ship there. His explanation was that O&I changed all the facts, and this is also my interpretation, to de-link 3 critical connections. The connection between Nikola Tesla, teleportation, and the Los Alamos physicists. So if you've had the enjoyment of wading through Al Bielik's material, the material of the Cameron brothers, some of the Montauk literature, the conventional telling of the Philadelphia experiment, yes, an experiment happened. But the real Philadelphia experiment didn't take place in Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. It was the attempt to focus in on the signing of the U.S. Constitution in Philadelphia via chronovision, which I'll describe next. And so we have to be careful because the U.S. Time Space Program was one of the most sensitive intelligence programs ever undertaken by the United States government. And there was an effort to both manipulate people into telling shaggy dog stories of what happened to them time traveling, and also to manipulate the actual accounts of things like the Philadelphia experiment. So in fact, it was an initial experiment with Tesla teleportation, but they didn't account for the fact that the whole ship was metal. Magnetic metal cannot teleport because it causes massive electrostatic discharge. Even one of the boys in the project, again, young David, one of my colleagues, left a nickel in his pocket when we teleported from Sandia back to the tarmac at Curtis Wright, and it actually got super agitated and hot and shot out of his pocket when we hit the tarmac at Curtis Wright. So we could have been killed like that by being shot like by a bullet. Okay, so I think the reason there was that energy array that we saw in Jones' presentation, that was the massive electrostatic discharge that was occurring when they tried to teleport the ship that they were using. So there was an initial flirtation with applied teleportation during the war. It resulted in a disastrous mishap in which there were fatalities, and they shelved the idea of using teleportation for what they wanted to do, which was use it so that when they detected a Nazi mine, the ship could actually teleport out of the way. According to Bob Beckwith, this experiment was tried after the Nazi Navy began chaining mines to the bottom of the Atlantic. Okay, so something like Philadelphia happened, but more teleportation than radar invisibility. And as a participant, I find it pretty easy to debug some of these cover stories because they're so improbable in the elements that are combined. For example, Al Bielik was a very, very nice man, and we have mutual friends. I talked to him on the phone in 2005 before his death. He was really just a tried and true good person. Very helpful. In fact, he called me spontaneous, and the first thing they said on the phone was, "So they got you kind of young, huh?" And so Al was a great guy. But in his account, I have to be true to the historical record. He conflates teleportation and reincarnation. 2 entirely different processes. One to physically move while you're in body, and the other what happens when you die. They're not connected. The only connection between teleportation and reincarnation, as manifest in his story about the Cameron brothers, he being one of them, is that one time when we were teleporting to Santa Fe, my thoughts were colored by the life review of an old man who was dying in southern Colorado. And at the lunch table, I was telling my dad, "Dad, I lived up here in southern Colorado. I was an old man. When I was dying, I was hanging out on the porch," and I described this to his whole life. And I said, in fact, his house is right up there on Highway 160 after we eat lunch in Pagosa Springs, and we go up 160. I know what the house is. So to his credit, even though my dad, again, was a Nixon Republican and a pretty hard-boiled engineer, not exactly somebody who would go day tripping into different dimensions of our experiences. Nonetheless, we went out on this excursion up there, and we spoke with this man's widow, and we determined that I couldn't have been him in a previous life because he had just died. And then when we were driving back to Santa Fe, I said to my dad, "Dad, it looks like I got his memories like when he was dying when we were teleporting into Santa Fe." And my dad went, "Yep." So there can be an overlay between physical displacement via teleportation and spiritual phenomena like somebody's life review when they're dying, but there's no one-to-one correlation between teleportation and reincarnation. So I just have the opportunity to debug some of those urban legends that have emerged both spontaneously and intentionally during the latter half of the 20th century regarding time travel. I'm alleging that I'm providing the actual programmatic timeline, the basic major facts about the program that actually emerged during those years. The fifth time travel technology that Project Pegasus was working with, the second major one besides the teleporter, was the chronovisor of Vernetti and Gemelli. They were different places in New Jersey and New Mexico. The first one I encountered was a rather rudimentary one at the old General Manufacturing Company facility in Convent Station, New Jersey. General Manufacturing had been the map-making subsidiary of Standard Oil, or ESSO, which is Standard Oil of New Jersey. And during World War II, it became the map-making function for the Allied war effort that Laura's great-grandfather so nobly advanced. And by the 1970s, that company that had been mapping places like Britain and France and Germany and Poland and Russia and so forth, Italy during the war, was now mapping the past and future. I remember entering the General Manufacturing Company facility. There was this huge 20-foot by 20-foot shellac map of England and the west coast of Europe. This would obviously be for the planning of the invasion to retake Europe from the Nazis. And over on the left side was one of the chronovisor devices. And they explained to us how this company had been mapping first, cities for your free maps at the ESSO service stations, then parts of the world during World War II, and now it was mapping the past and future. The chronovisor was over on the left, so let me just describe what a chronovisor looks like. It looks like it's basically this node of polished bismuth crystals. Bismuth is a trans-chronological element. According to my researcher friend Brett Stillings, who was in my Mars training course in 1980 and later I was on Mars with, Brett believes that there's been a cover-up of the periodic table, and that if you start at bismuth, which is element 83, and add 32, you get, of course, the element 115 that Robert Lazar claimed was behind the gravitic propulsion of the ET craft. Well, Brett takes it all to element 307. He actually believes he can demonstrate mathematically and scientifically that there are 307 elements in the universe. I'm not a chemist, I'm not a physicist, I don't know whether I can reality test that, but I do know to a personal and historical certainty that bismuth was the element they were using in the crystal array in the ceiling of the chronovisor. Now what were they doing? According to my father, they were driving an electromagnetic signal through this 8-sided or octagonal array of bismuth crystals, and it was generating a field of light, a hologram that was so dense that it had a lensing effect whereby non-local events streamed into the laboratory. So if you stood outside this hologram, you could see what was going on there in this kind of beautiful form of cubical cinema. But if you were immersed in the hologram when it was turned on, you literally went there because now that event was brought around you. So my first exposure to chronovision occurred, it was actually the flat screen chronovision of Vernetti and Gemelli. Forgot about this. We were taken to what my father later described as a national security watch post in Flemington, New Jersey in the fall of 1970, after we had been teleporting to Santa Fe and back for the summer of 70. So in fall of 70, they took us to a hologram display at a Newark, New Jersey art museum. We, of course, had lectures on teleportation and also chronovision that summer. We're taken to this national security watch post in Flemington, New Jersey, where technicians were operating these big, bulky machines in which inside the machines, they were propagating a hologram of a past event. They were filming it with 16mm black and white film stock, taking the film out, determining what time and place they had just filmed, and then dropping those canisters of past scenes of past events into collection baskets, like the ones that you have at libraries that collect microfilm, those plastic postal box-like things. So that you'd see a technician take the film out and put it in the canister and write Holland, 1820, Paris, 1930, Northern China, 2000 BC, Central Arizona, 2 million BC, and so forth. They were just basically filming the past. They were wearing white lab coats. I remember asking them during the field trip there whether they could cheat and invest in stocks they learned about in the future, presently that would be advantageous to invest in now after growing in the future. And they explained how all of the people involved, all of the adults involved in Pegasus had sworn oaths not to privateer on the information that they were getting via quantum access. I believe that my father was being paid in oil and natural gas stocks from Texas and Oklahoma. I think that was his fringe benefits. Because at my mother's death in 2003, we found that lockbox, and it was stuffed with like 200 different defunct Texas and Oklahoma stocks. And one of my sister-in-laws went through it and found out that they were all basically, junk stocks at that point. But during that, they told us that they couldn't privateer. So you couldn't, go to 1990 and then decide to wait a little bit and buy Microsoft in 1980 and that type of thing. Okay, so in the chronovisor room there at the National Security Watch Post in Flemington, we were leaving, and one of the technicians pointed to an 8-inch circular display on one of these bulky machines and said, boys, to me and David again, said, boys, do you know what this is? And thinking that I was smarter than I actually was, I said something like, oh, that must be an historical reenactment of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, like on public television or something, in Philly or in New Jersey. And he said, nope, it's not the signing of the U.S. Constitution, because who's that? And he put one forefinger on the man standing on the right, which is George Washington, presiding over the signing of the U.S. Constitution on September 17th of 1787. What we were looking at was not this auspicious moment in human history from this angle, but from the other side of the room. So as I looked at this screen, Washington was on the left, looking towards the center of the group. Benjamin Franklin was a huge individual with a big domed head, very distinctively identifiable as Franklin. Washington was much harder for me to make out visually. But Franklin was sitting there on this sofa about two leaps or bounds from Washington, standing on the dais. And then the rest of the attendees or the signers were just men smaller than Franklin who were just sitting in ordinary straight-back chairs in a couple rows to Washington's left. Okay, so this famous historical rendering, I don't know who it was painted by, but this was from the opposite side of the event, and Franklin wasn't sitting there. He was sitting over on the other side of the room. So we were seeing this scene as if it had been filmed through that center window in the background. And he said, well, who's this? And I said, oh, that's George Washington. Oh, that must be a reenactment of the signing of the U.S. Constitution. And as we were being pulled away by our team leader, Elaine Gallagher, who was our main educator back at the Learning Lab, the special educator from the Hanover Township School District who had been assigned to the project, who was taking us through all the speed learning and all that stuff, all the psychic game playing. She said, boys, we have to go. I mean, the field trip's over. And this technician actually swung on his chair and said, boys, that isn't a reenactment of the signing of the U.S. Constitution. That is the signing of the U.S. Constitution. So as an American lawyer, I really feel privileged to have seen the signing of the U.S. Constitution in childhood. And that's why I'm so adamant that every school child in America and the rest of the world should have the same opportunity to go to museums and libraries and look in at auspicious moments in human history like this.